Good day. As is traditional with these programs, I'm going to start with a brief rundown of the situation on the battlefields in Ukraine, and I'm going to just discuss some of the current military developments, though I should say that some of the information about the latter is for the moment relatively sketchy. But let's talk first of all about what's happening on the battlefields, and here most of the information now, in fact the information overwhelmingly over the last few days and weeks has been about the ongoing battle for Bakhmut. And perhaps the best summary of what's happening has come from a Russian telegram channel called Slavyangrad. Now this is a Russian telegram channel. Ukrainians no doubt would have a different account of events. I would say Slavyangrad is far from being necessarily sympathetic to Putin. It's strongly opposed, for example, the withdrawal from Kherson region. And I'm going to say that, in my opinion, that the people who operate it, they seem to be ideologically well to the left of Putin's government, which brings them close to the Russian Communist Party. And in any event, as I've said, they're not necessarily supporters either of Putin, and they're prepared to be critical of the Russian military as well. But it is a Russian channel. It clearly supports the war, and that is obviously something one must take into account in assessing its reports. However, and for the record, I have found them consistently reliable, and I think this is probably the most reliable summary of the situation in Bakhmut on the 14th of December 2022. Now, I ought to say that, of course, this being a Russian channel, it refers to Bakhmut by its Russian name or Soviet name of Artyomovsk, but of course it is Bakhmut that we're talking about, or at least the city, the town, the Ukrainians call Bakhmut. Anyway, this is the summary. 1. Intense fighting continues for Opitnoye. The enemy continues to send, the enemy of course is the Ukrainians, continue to send reinforcements there. The Wagner organization continued their assault operations. 2. Also, the units of the Wagner organization are advancing on the eastern outskirts of the city. Assault groups are gradually moving deeper into, well, I'm going to say Bakhmut. Several houses on Maximenko, I'm not sure where that is, are occupied. Fighting also continues in the area of the industrial zone on Patrice Lumumba Street. 3. There is fighting near Kleshchkaya and in the Kurdyumovka area. The enemy reinforces its positions near Chasov Yar. The enemy, of course, being the Ukrainians. 4. Fighting is taking place on the northeast of Bakhmut. I'm going to stick to calling it Bakhmut for the moment, in the direction of the Bakhmut-Solidar highway and near Podgorodny. Overall, the Ukrainian defenses are cracking and slowly buckling, but it is premature to speak of a breakthrough or a disintegration of the defenses. Advancement requires serious effort. And now that is a Russian take on the fighting, a summary of what's actually going on. I suspect it is reliable. I think that it is probably as good and as accurate a summary of the fighting in Bakhmut, of the actual position of the battle lines in Bakhmut, as we're going to get. And it corresponds with what I'm also getting from other sources. I would say not entirely so. There's some reports, for example, that Opitnoye, the battle for Opitnoye, which has been raging over the last couple of days, has now supposedly ended with the Russians in full control of this village or suburb of Bakhmut. That was one report that I saw. This report, which I just read, suggests that the fighting there is still continuing. And I also read another report that a sparkling wine factory, Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, as it was in Soviet times, and quite probably will be again before long, is a center, or at least before the war, was a center of sparkling wine production. Anyway, the sparkling wine factory has apparently also been taken over by the Russians. I've also seen some other maps of the fighting in Bakhmut, some maps of the town itself and its surrounding localities, and it does suggest that the Russians are pressing their assault on Bakhmut very closely indeed. Now, I have to qualify that. I don't see very well. I can't be sure that I'm reading these maps properly or accurately, but in fairness, I think I probably am. And again, it does look as if the situation in Bakhmut is becoming extremely difficult. There's also reports that the Ukrainians are indeed trying to replace some of the units that have been defending Bakhmut and which have suffered very severe losses with fresh units. But there are also apparently concerns in Ukraine. This is not something you're going to find very much on Ukrainian channels, but for what it's worth, I also think that this is also true, that there are reports that more and more people in Ukraine are becoming seriously concerned about the level of losses that the Ukrainian army is experiencing, is having inflicted upon it in its attempt to defend Bakhmut. And there was a report yesterday, which I saw repeated today, which said that hospitals in Kiev are now refusing to take further admissions, apparently or allegedly or supposedly because the overflow of wounded soldiers from the Bakhmut battlefield is now extending to hospitals in Kiev, all the hospitals in eastern Ukraine having now been overwhelmed by the number of these wounded soldiers. Well, that is a rather dramatic claim. I can't confirm its accuracy. Again, I reported it does seem indisputable that Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut are now extremely high, and we saw those reports in the British media last week that also seem to confirm that the fighting in Bakhmut is extremely intense and that the Ukrainians are coming under enormous pressure there. By the way, and for the record, I have seen nothing that suggests that anything analogous is happening on the Russian side, that Russian losses are in any way comparable, or that hospitals in Western Russia are becoming overwhelmed in treating Russian wounded from Bakhmut. And I have to say this, I have no doubt at all that if that was indeed the case, whatever attempt the Russian authorities made to try to censor that fact, well, I am sure that information about it would have come to me by this point. So I just want to make those points. Now, there's also been some other reports which I consider less reliable, but again, I'm going to reference them. Some of these do appear to come from Ukrainian sources. One expresses concern that Ukraine's reserves, manpower reserves, are being burnt through in the fighting in Bakhmut. That this attempt to hold Bakhmut is eating up the reserves that Ukraine built up over the summer and which have already been severely depleted as a result of the fighting in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region over the course of the autumn. Now again, I can't fully confirm this. It's a difficult report to confirm one way or the other. But if true, it would be confirmation that number that Colonel McGregor, perhaps it would lend support maybe, rather than provide confirmation, but it would lend support to Colonel McGregor's assertion that the Ukrainian military is now down to 190,000 men. Now, there's also been another report, and this one is a particularly difficult report to corroborate. I'm far from certain that this is true, but there are both Ukrainian and Russian channels that reference it. It could be true. But anyway, again, it's an interesting report. I'm going to mention it one more time. It's one of those reports which I'm not sure whether it's true. I'm not sure whether it's not. Take it with that degree of skepticism. But this one does sound plausible. This is that General Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian chief of staff, has apparently reported to Zelensky. There's apparently been a big meeting discussing the situation in eastern Ukraine, that Zaluzhny has apparently informed Zelensky that Bakhmut is undefendable, that the losses there are out of proportion to any conceivable gain, and that Zaluzhny wants to withdraw the forces, the Ukrainian forces defending Bakhmut, to Kramatorsk, and to try to establish new defense lines there. And apparently Zaluzhny, or at least perhaps I should say allegedly Zaluzhny, reminded Zelensky of the success, the Ukrainians' success in withdrawing their garrison from Lysychansk, the forces that had been defending Lysychansk earlier in the summer, and when which those forces which were withdrawn from Lysychansk were rebuilt and could be used to hold back the Russian advance in Donbass, and providing the foundation for the Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region. So that's, as I said, allegedly a report that Zaluzhny supposedly provided to Zelensky. The same report, the same source that has published this report, claims that Zelensky rejected Zaluzhny's proposal to withdraw the troops from Bakhmut, to surrender Bakhmut to the Russians. If that's true, by the way, I find that very difficult to understand. But anyway, Zelensky did, and he did this for two reasons, supposedly. And these are reasons which, again, I'm going to say I find it difficult to understand them. The first is that losing Bakhmut would be a major blow, both to domestic morale within Ukraine. It would finally dissipate whatever remaining optimism had been, which had been created by the offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, and it would also go down badly with Ukraine's Western allies. And I think here that probably means Britain, Poland, and the United States first and foremost. That supposedly these countries do not want to see Ukraine giving up ground. Now, again, I don't know whether the latter is true. I suspect in the United States there's much more of an open discussion about this. After all, some of the most trenchant critics of the war are ex-Ukrainian, ex-US officers, Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, Daniel Davis, and others. So, I suspect there's probably more of a discussion about this in the US than there is elsewhere. But I did notice that over the course of those reports that were circulating in Britain last week, there did seem still to be a hope, at least, that Ukraine would be able to hold on to Bakhmut, despite the massive losses that it was suffering, and that might indeed be the wish of the British leadership, the British political and military leadership. But again, they don't speak to me, so I don't know. But anyway, that was one of the reasons that Zelensky gave, that it would be a blow to morale, both within Ukraine and amongst Ukraine's Western allies, and might deter those Western allies from continuing in their support for Ukraine. That was one reason Zelensky gave. I don't think it's a good reason, by the way. I think, for various reasons, which I'll discuss in a moment, I don't think it makes any kind of sense. The second reason that Zelensky gave, however, I have to say, I find absolutely extraordinary. Allegedly, and again, I have to use that word allegedly because I'm not absolutely sure that, I'm far from sure that this conversation, this discussion took place, but allegedly, Zelensky told Zaluzhny that Ukraine couldn't just abandon Bakhmut because doing so would call into question the wisdom of asking Ukrainian soldiers to accept the massive losses that Ukraine has already experienced in trying to defend Bakhmut. In other words, because there have been so many losses already, we must reinforce rather than retreat, even if that means we suffer still more losses. I don't know whether that is true or not. All I will say is it is the kind of decision that political leaders do sometimes make. They worry first and foremost about losing face. They find it very, very difficult to cut their losses, to draw down on a failed investment. I'm sorry to use that somewhat cold-blooded language, but I'm trying to explain the reasoning of this. And the fact that thousands of people have been killed defending a particular location causes them to keep on trying to defend that location, lest they are criticized for the original decision to defend that location. Well, I have to say, I don't know whether that was what Zelensky said to Zaluzhny, but after what I've seen from Zelensky over the past year, and the extent to which Zelensky and his team do seem to be perhaps excessively focused on the public relations or propaganda aspect of the war, if that is what Zelensky said to Zaluzhny, well, it would not surprise me. Now, both arguments, if they were made, are very, very bad arguments. But talking about morale, the real damage to morale will not be caused by abandoning or retreating from Bakhmut. It is from the deaths of all of those Ukrainian soldiers that have been defending Bakhmut. And if we come to the second argument, if Bakhmut is eventually captured by the Russians, if it does eventually fall, and everybody who's looking at the situation in Bakhmut appears to agree that it will fall, well, then the damage to morale will be even greater because of the number of losses Ukraine has suffered in trying to defend it. And I'm going to just make an observation which responds to some of the comments that I've seen on from some of the comments on my threads of my own videos, and also, by the way, on the threads of multiple other articles, and indeed in some articles that have appeared in the media as well. And that's the fact that the Russians have not been able to capture Bakhmut after 4 months is somehow seen as a blow to the Russians and a success to Ukraine. I think is completely false reasoning. I think that if holding on to Bakhmut is leading to Ukraine suffering catastrophic losses, then the fact that Ukraine has gone on suffering those catastrophic losses for 4 months, weakening the Ukrainian army in the process, and, by the way, causing massive death and injury to Ukrainian people, well, far from that being any sort of success, it looks to me to be a disaster. So I just want to say that, and that's absolutely my view. If saving thousands of men, maintaining, preserving the Ukrainian army would have been better achieved by pulling out of Bakhmut in August or in September, and it is of course the Ukrainians today who insist on Bakhmut's relative unimportance, well, all I can say about that is that in that case, the Ukrainians should have done it in August or September or whenever it was, rather than throw thousands of men into the battle, causing hundreds of them, thousands of them quite possibly, to lose their lives and to be massively injured. Now, about those losses and about those injuries, there is a report circulating, there's been many reports like this, that a full account of Ukrainian losses supposedly provided to the Ukrainian leadership by the Ukrainian military. That a full list of these losses is now circulating. It was apparently obtained through hacking, or allegedly obtained through hacking, and supposedly it already refers to 38,000 Ukrainian soldiers who are missing, presumably presumed dead. I haven't seen this document. I'm not going to try and guess whether or not it's true or not until I've seen it. All I would say is that there's been other documents of this nature that have circulated in the past, and they've turned out to be false. They've turned out to be fabrications. So I would be extremely careful before I accepted the truth of this one. Anyway, I will eventually, no doubt, have an opportunity to see this document, at least in translation, and I will then give my view of it. But for the moment, I would treat that document with massive skepticism. Anyway, that's the situation in Bakhmut. What's going on elsewhere? Well, parts of the Western media, notably, I think, the Guardian newspaper, but sometimes other parts of the British media as well, continue to talk about a possible Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye, and they also talk about Ukraine operating on the east side of the Dnieper River, presumably in Kherson region. Now, I have to say again that I'm completely unable to understand the last claim, because I've seen no evidence of Ukrainian ground forces having crossed the Dnieper River from the West Bank to the East Bank and holding out there. I've received no reports of any battles, and I have really no idea what this refers to. If this is a case of reconnaissance units from the Ukrainian side, slipping across the river, the dead of night in little boats and trying to survey Russian positions and then darting back to the West Bank, well, I'm sure that happens. I'm also sure that the Russians do the same. But I don't see any evidence, I've seen no evidence at all, of any significant Ukrainian formations operating east of the Dnieper River in Kherson region. I've not seen any sign of a Ukrainian crossing of the Dnieper River, no reports of amphibious landings, no reports of pontoon bridges or anything like that being constructed. I'm absolutely sure that if something like that was really happening, then I would know about it. What I do know about is that there is undoubtedly shelling taking place. The Russians shelling the Ukrainians on the East Bank, the Ukrainians shelling the Russians on the West Bank. Again, it is clear that the Russians are heavily outgun the Ukrainians. I've discussed already how it's been impossible for Ukraine to establish any kind of civil authority in Kherson city, and how they've had to evacuate the remaining inhabitants from that city. And as it happens, today, early in the morning, I saw a photograph of a Russian drone strike on the administration building in Kherson city, the same building which way back a couple of months ago, if you remember, if you were watching my videos, one of the first telltale signs that the Russians were actively preparing to withdraw from Kherson city was that the Russian flag had been taken down from that administration building. Well, now the Russians are shelling and launching drone attacks against it, and there's a picture of it with smoke billowing from some kind of a drone attack. And indeed, this morning, lots of reports all over the various channels, and by the way, the Western media as well, of a major drone attack by the Russians on Ukraine, uranium-true drones apparently operating in many parts of Ukraine, this time including Kiev itself. Now, I don't have anything like the full picture, and I'm not going to try and assess it until I know a little bit more. Lastly, there's also reports that the Ukrainians have finally given up their plan to launch some kind of offensive into northern Lugansk from Kharkiv region, that they've been pushed onto the defensive here, and that they're doing what the Russians have already done. They're trying to build fortifications to defend themselves against whatever offensive in this area the Russians might be planning later this winter. Well, again, I don't have very much information about this. It's just a report which I have seen. So that is all I can say about the situation on the battlefields. Always fog of war, always reports, some of which seem reliable, others perhaps interesting and plausible, perhaps rather less reliable. I ought to say again, by the way, lots of other things I read and hear, which I completely disregard because, in my opinion, they're mostly fiction. But you get some of that from both sides. But those are the reports which I've seen and read today, which are either reliable, like the one about the fighting in Bakhmut, the state of the battle in Bakhmut, and others which perhaps are a little less reliable, but which could plausibly be true and are interesting and do give perhaps something of a sense of the progress of the war. Now, what is indisputable is that the Western powers have become increasingly alarmed by the Russian drone and missile strikes on Ukraine. The Russian missile strikes directed against Ukraine's energy system, the Russian drone attacks, and the way in which these are inflicting massive damage upon Ukraine. And it's absolutely clear now that there's been a major lobbying exercise to try to get the United States to supply Ukraine with more advanced weapons in order to try to counter this drone and missile offensive. We've had this from some NATO officials, including, by the way, Jens Stoltenberg. We've had it from Boris Johnson in an op-ed he wrote for the Wall Street Journal. We've had it in that article that appeared the other day in the Financial Times, which admitted that Ukraine is almost out of its S-300 and Buk missiles. And yesterday, we got the first glimmer of news about the effect of this lobbying campaign. Now, can I say, and I've discussed this before, the United States, perhaps without fully understanding the fact, and certainly without any proper discussion of the fact, is now finding itself in a situation where it is being forced, as a result of Russian moves over the course of this war, into a pattern of continuous escalation. This is very like, by the way, what happened over the course of the war in Vietnam, when the United States started with a small number of troops on the ground who were supposed to be advisors, and a certain amount of weaponry supplied to the South Vietnamese army, and eventually, inexorably, as the situation continued nonetheless to deteriorate, it ended up sending 500,000 men, most of the US Air Force, most of the US military, and committed a vast amount of the US's conventional forces to the battle in Vietnam, with all the consequences that we all know. Well, we are in a similar pattern of escalation. And again, as in Vietnam, with every setback, with every failure, we get the hardliners coming back, demanding more weapons, more supplies, more money to Ukraine, saying how important it is, how essential it is, how vital it is to the United States that it prevail or be seen to prevail in Ukraine. And of course, the result is more escalation. And yesterday, we got some indications of what the form of that escalation is going to be. We had an article in CNN, it looks very well sourced, that the Biden administration is now very close and has apparently made effectively a decision to supply Patriot surface-to-air missile batteries to Ukraine. Now, let's just take a step back and look at the pattern of American escalation in Ukraine. We started with light weapons, with Stingers and Javelins. Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, manpads, Javelins anti-tank missiles. They were supposed to be the weapons that were going to throw the Russians back, that they were going to change the effect of the fighting on the battlefields. It didn't happen. The Stingers were relatively unsuccessful, the Javelins even more so. So the United States then cranked up and started to supply artillery. And there were deliveries of the M777 howitzers, and the United States' Western allies also started to supply artillery to Ukraine, and we were told that the Western artillery was far superior to the Russian, that it had longer range, that it was far more accurate, that it would be the game changer in the battle. Except it has turned out otherwise, and after a certain effect, that artillery has proved far from being any sort of game changer, as I've discussed in recent programs. It turns out that the newer Russian guns, the Matka and the Star, have the same sort of range and accuracy with unguided ammunition that the Western guns do, and that the Russians also have precision-guided shells. They're perhaps not quite as sophisticated as the American Excalibur shells. But anyway, that's what happened. We got heavier guns. And then when it turned out that the guns weren't making the big difference, we got the HIMARS multiple rocket launch systems. And these were going to prove the great game changer in the battle. And they were initially, let's say this, they did have a certain impact. They were quite effective. They are fairly long-ranged, but their major advantage, the one that made them rather expensive to use, but their major advantage is that they have precision guidance. So they're not like the older Russian multiple rocket launch systems like the Grad, the Uragan, and the Smerch, which are unguided and are basically saturation weapons intended to be launched in vast quantities to, saturate the battlefield. These, a little bit like the US artillery, are sort of much more precise weapons, sniper-type weapons, if you like, intended to strike particular targets at medium ranges with considerable precision and accuracy. And as I said, initially they did have a certain impact, but that impact quickly wore off. The Russians learnt how to disperse their ammunition and things of that kind to shield them from the HIMARS missiles, and perhaps more worryingly for the US, the Russian air defense system, the very advanced Russian air defense system, has gradually been upgraded to the point where it is proving increasingly successful in shooting down HIMARS missiles. And just last week, we got reports that the Russians now have a more advanced software package which they can install on their Panzer gun missile point defense system, which will make it even more effective in shooting down the HIMARS missiles. I would also add, by the way, that the Russians claim that they have destroyed 12 of the 20 HIMARS launch vehicles that were supplied by the US to Ukraine, though this is vigorously denied both by Ukraine and by the United States. I'm not going to arbitrate on the truth of this. All I will say is that I think that the claim that no HIMARS launch vehicles have been destroyed at all, I think that is unlikely to be true, and I'm sure that the Russians have destroyed at least some, even if perhaps not quite as many as they claim. The HIMARS system also has run into a further problem, by the way, which is that its missiles turn out to be expensive. The stockpile of these systems is not perhaps as big as it might have been, and it's becoming increasingly depleted. And the extent to which Ukraine can continue to use HIMARS missiles, well, the number of those launches appears to be fading, with Ukraine apparently being told by the United States to reduce the quantity of HIMARS that it is using. So the HIMARS had an effect. It was only an effect that we saw for a couple of weeks, and it's an effect which has faded. Now we have the decision from the United States to supply the Patriot surface-to-air missile system. Now, I'm going to say a few things about this, but the first thing I would say is that I am not an expert on surface-to-air missile systems. The best discussion, again, about the capabilities of the system, which I have seen, is from Brian Beletic on the new Atlas channel. Now, I'm going to just say a few things, however. First of all, we don't know how many of these systems that the United States is intending to supply to Ukraine. The CNN article sort of suggested that it would be a single battery, which, if true, is, to be frank, not anywhere near enough to make a decisive difference. But then again, when the HIMARS systems were first sent to Ukraine, as I sort of remember, the United States was initially only going to send 4, and that 4 increased, and we ended up with 20. So quite plausibly, the United States is going to send more than one battery, even if publicly or semi-publicly it's sort of saying that only one battery is going to be provided now. Now, I'm going to say something else about this deployment of the Patriot. Brian Beletic, in his program, has said that this is a very complicated and difficult system to operate. It requires extensive training, which would take many months, all of which I've no doubt is true. Brian Beletic doesn't believe that Ukraine could conceivably use this Patriot system if it was supplied, say, next week. And the CNN article seemed to imply that it would be supplied next week. So Brian Beletic suggests, and he may be entirely right about this, that the Patriot is going to be delivered with contractors, let's call them contractors from NATO countries, perhaps not Americans, perhaps from some of the European NATO countries, people who've already been trained to use it. They will be sent into Ukraine, and it will be they who will initially operate it. And Brian Beletic correctly says that that would be a major escalation, and if that is indeed what happens, he would of course be right. That could indeed be what is going to happen, but there is a further possibility, and that is that the decision to provide Ukraine with Patriot missiles was actually taken weeks and months ago, and that there's been Ukrainians being provided with training in operating the system, and that this goes back several weeks or several months ago. I say that because it is now clear to me, and I don't think it is even denied any longer, that many of the weapon systems, the Western weapon systems that Ukraine has been supplied with over the course of this conflict, have been supplied to Ukraine or were in the process of being supplied to Ukraine long before the actual announcement of the decision to supply them. In the case of the Javelin and Stinger missiles, for what it's worth, I'm absolutely sure that quite a lot of them were supplied to Ukraine before the conflict even began. So it's possible that there are already Ukrainians being trained to use the Patriot system, and that this has been an ongoing process going back several weeks, perhaps even a month or so, perhaps all the way back to October, when the Russian missile offensive first began, perhaps going back further still. My guess is that that has indeed been the case, though, as happened with HIMARS, I am absolutely sure that there are some Western technicians, I'm going to call them, or NATO technicians, including Americans, going to be involved in operating these Patriot systems in Ukraine. So I'm absolutely sure that is true. I think Brian Beletic is right about this, and I strongly suspect that there are going to be Ukrainians as well, and that they have been already trained up to a point in using this system, that perhaps they won't use it especially well. But perhaps the big question is, what difference is this system actually going to make? Is it going to be the big game changer that some people perhaps hope it will be? And I'm, by the way, going to leave the discussion about possible Russian responses, escalatory responses, to the deployment of the Patriot responses for Russian responses about out-of-area actions to a later program. Let's just talk about what difference the Patriot might make on the battlefield. Well, I'm going to say straight away that I am not an expert on surface-to-air missile technologies. I don't know very much about the Patriot system, and given the fact that I'm not a technical person in any shape or form, I'm hardly the right person or the best person to talk about that side of things. Brian Beletic, who's far more familiar with this system or understands this kind of system, has a better knowledge of this sort of thing than I do, does talk about it significantly on his program. He's talked about this in previous programs as well. I'm going to just make a few short observations. The first one is that it's been a consistent pattern that when non-aligned countries have been offered the Patriot or the Russian S-400 system, they have consistently opted for the Russian S-400 system. This has been true of Turkey, and it has been true of India as well. Now, there may be political reasons for this, but I can't help but think that this must point to the fact that the Turks and the Indians, who've had an opportunity to assess both systems, conclude that the Russian system is definitely, technologically speaking, and the superior system, and militarily speaking, the more effective system. The second point I'm going to make is that Ukraine, of course, has had a fairly sophisticated air defense system based on the S-300 system, which was developed in the Soviet Union as its equivalent to the Patriot missiles of that period. Now, of course, we're talking about the 1980s, and the Ukrainian S-300s perhaps have stagnated technologically. The US Patriot system probably has not done. I mean, you go to the Wikipedia entry about it, there's lots of references to upgrades and things of that kind. So no doubt it's a more sophisticated, more advanced system than the S-300 that the Ukrainians have. But I wonder how much more sophisticated. In fact, you look at capabilities, if you look at range, for example, it seems as if some variants of the S-300 system, going back to the 1980s, have a significantly longer range and, on paper, greater capabilities than the Patriot does, even the more modern versions of the Patriot. I've seen a report that the Patriot missile, even the most long-range version of it, has a range of 60 kilometers, in which case it is very heavily outranged by Russian and former Soviet systems. So that's the first point I would make. It might not be, in other words, it might not offer Ukraine much in terms of additional capability than its existing S-300 missiles have done. And then, of course, there is the problem that the United States is almost certainly not going to be able to supply Ukraine with anything like the numbers of Patriot missiles that would adequately replace the S-300s and the Buk systems with which Ukraine started this war. Now, this has been a consistent pattern. If we're talking about artillery, we see that the United States and its Western allies were able to provide Ukraine with a certain amount of artillery pieces and a certain amount of 155mm artillery shells, but it became very clear very quickly that this did not even equal the number of our guns and shells with which the Ukraine started the war, and Ukraine has been burning through the stocks of those which have been supplied incredibly fast. And it's been true with tanks, it's been true with all kinds of other machines that have been supplied. The numbers that the West can provide to Ukraine cannot even match those with which Ukraine started the war. And given the size of Ukraine, given the diversity of targets, given the Patriot system's more limited range as compared with the S-300s, I do wonder whether the system can hope to provide the degree of coverage and protection that Ukraine's systems, S-300 based system, originally had done. This is just my own observation. Then there is the even more complex question of numbers of missiles. Now, Brian Belletti said on his program, and he provided the information that the United States, he read it from a authoritative mainstream media news source, that the United States makes 250 Patriot missiles. It's the actual missiles that get launched. It makes around 250 of these a year. There are plans to double that number, but this is going to be a complex and difficult enterprise. It's the case with all systems that the United States makes. Increasing the volumes, the production volumes, is challenging and difficult, and it will be years before the United States is able to increase the number of Patriot missiles that it builds. Well, Ukraine says that Russia makes around 40 cruise missiles a month. So already Russia is making more cruise missiles, many more cruise missiles, around 500 cruise missiles a year, according to Ukrainian estimates, as opposed to the 250 Patriot missiles that the United States builds in a year. Given that in order to intercept a missile, you would normally launch 2 or perhaps even 3 surface-to-air missiles. Already, even if the Ukrainian numbers are true, Ukraine would be burning through new production of Patriot missiles very fast. It would be launching more missiles than the United States is able to produce, simply to match its estimate of Russian production. Is that estimate even true? Well, the Russians have been launching against Ukraine somewhere in the region of 140, sometimes slightly more than that, missiles, cruise missiles every month. And it's been suggested, and I think it's plausible, that this is representative of current Russian production batches. In other words, the Russians are probably building in excess of 150 cruise missiles a month. Now, I say in excess because I cannot believe that the Russians are launching every cruise missile that they build at Ukraine. They will surely want to keep some back, hold some back in their reserve stocks. Now, I say, of course, that this is all speculative. I don't know how many cruise missiles Russia actually builds. Some will say that 100, 150 is far too many. It's inconceivable that Russia could be producing that number of cruise missiles. I mean, that's a sort of consistent story. We hear that the Russians don't have the abilities, the industrial abilities to produce that many cruise missiles. But to repeat again, that is the pattern of Russian missile strikes on Ukraine. They're launching, say, 150 missiles at Ukraine a month. Now, if that's true, if that's actually the number of missiles that the Russians are actually building, cruise missiles that the Russians are building, then they're building more cruise missiles every 2 months than the totality of US production of Patriots. In fact, they would be, the situation would be worse, because as we've seen, the Ukrainians would normally be expected to launch 2 Patriot missiles at every Russian missile in order to achieve a hit. And there's no way on current production rates that the United States would be able to keep up with that level of use. But of course, there are the stocks. Now, Wikipedia says that something like 10,000 missiles, Patriot missiles, have been built by the United States ever since the system's entry back in the 1980s. Now, some of these will be old missiles, though of course they can be refurbished, and we shouldn't discount their utility. After all, Ukraine is using S-300 missiles, which were built by the Soviet Union, some of them way back in the 1970s. So we shouldn't discount that. The fact that, those missiles, that there are these stockpiles of these missiles, and the United States could draw on those. But the United States has to have a stockpile of Patriot missiles for itself, and it supplies Patriot missiles to its various allies. And quite a lot of countries, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, the European allies of the United States operate the Patriot system, and they have to have a stockpile of missiles. And if the United States has to start eating into that stockpile because its current production can't keep up with Ukrainian use of these missiles, well, that's going to be a problem, especially given what Brian Beletic also said on that program in the new Atlas, which is that there is already, in fact, a shortage of missiles, Patriot missiles, to the point where the United States has been obliged to turn to other Persian Gulf states in order to make up for the rundown in Saudi stocks of Patriot missile systems, the Saudis having been obliged to launch systems to defend themselves from Yemeni, from Houthi missile and drone attacks. So I can very easily see in this situation how the whole story with the 155mm ammunition, the HIMARS rockets, could start to repeat itself. That the United States finds that by deploying Patriot missiles to Ukraine, supplying Ukraine with Patriot missiles, firstly, there are too many gaps in the defenses. It may not be able to shoot down all of the cruise missiles the Russians launch, and the expenditure of missiles not only exceeds the production rate of those Patriot missiles, but is starting to reduce dangerously the existing, already overstretched stockpile. Now, I ought to say here that I'm assuming, it's a big assumption, but I think it's a reasonable one, that building subsonic cruise missiles, which is what the Russians have predominantly up to this point been launching at Ukraine, is an easier process. It requires less complicated technologies than building supersonic, high-speed Patriot surface-to-air missiles. I mean, that seems logical to me. And of course, the Russians, as I said, that's one reason, by the way, why I think the Russians probably have a very significant advantage in building cruise missiles over American ability to build supersonic Patriot missiles. Then, of course, there are other issues, because the Patriot, whatever its capabilities, and I know a lot of people are skeptical about its capabilities. I've read reports which suggest that it's not actually a very effective system. I'm not going to go there. I'm not in a position to assess this. But anyway, reports that I've also read, and these are authoritative, these come from Russian sources, say that the Russians are now building up their stockpile, not just of their standard subsonic cruise missiles, but of their supersonic and hypersonic missiles. The Russians operate a supersonic missile called the Onyx. That's been in service for quite a long time. We don't know how extensive the stockpiles of those missiles is. It's a reasonable guess, since this system has been in production for quite a long time, that it is substantial. But the point is that the Russians are also building up their stockpile of hypersonic missiles. Now, they already operate a system called the Kinzhal in apparently relatively small quantities. There's suggestions that there may be 75 to 100 of these systems in service in total. But just a few weeks ago, the Russian news agency TASS, official news agency, said that the Russian Ministry of Defense has now put in an order for dozens of Zircon hypersonic missiles. Now, it is universally acknowledged that the United States, that the Patriot cannot intercept hypersonic missiles. Now, I'm guessing again that hypersonic missiles are more expensive to build and more complicated to build than supersonic missiles. So presumably a Zircon is more expensive than a Patriot. That's I think a reasonable guess. But of course, it can still be used to attack important targets in Ukraine, and the United States can't defend against them. And it does seem as if these systems are going to be there in growing numbers. So I can already see various problems, but there is a further problem. And that is, again, I don't know how many Patriots the United States intends to deploy in Ukraine, but what is indisputable is that Ukraine is already facing a major logistics crisis. And there's just been an article on this very point in the Wall Street Journal. A lot of these weapon systems that have been supplied to Ukraine, the M777s, the HIMARS presumably, but that they have heavy maintenance requirements. It's not realistic to refurbish them in Ukraine itself, because any attempt to establish depots and refurbishment facilities would be easily exposed to Russian missile attack, including, by the way, hypersonic missile attack, so that the United States has been forced to set up repair facilities for these systems in Germany, and that these systems have to be sent to Germany and repaired there and refurbished there and then sent back to Ukraine. Well, that's already producing problems, apparently, with things like light guns, like the M777. The Patriot system is of a completely different level of complexity and scale. If Ukraine, the West, is having difficulty keeping the existing relatively simple systems, Western systems operated by Ukraine, operating, how much more trouble is it going to have trying to keep the Patriot systems in Ukraine in operating conditions, in condition? And I would have thought that this is not only going to be an enormous challenge, but it's also going to limit the number of these systems that can be realistically supplied. I wonder whether, in fact, what's going to happen is that we're going to get a very small number of Patriot systems based around, say, Kiev, perhaps Western Ukraine. Still, as I said, potential targets for Russian systems. This is not a system that can be shuttled around quickly, so the Russians would quickly be able to see where it was. But anyway, that's another story. Because realistically, keeping large numbers of these systems operating in every area of Ukraine, including eastern Ukraine, where, by the way, most of the Russian cruise missile strikes take place, that is going to be logistically, well, perhaps not impossible, but extraordinarily difficult. Anyway, in summary, am skeptical that this is going to be any more of a game changer than any of those other Western systems were. The M777s, the HIMARS missiles, the Javelins, the Stingers, going back even before the Bayraktar drones. All of these Western systems have been supplied to Ukraine. They've all helped Ukraine stagger along, but the problems have been enormous, and, well, all that it's done is prolong a war which Ukraine continues to lose. It's also dangerously depleting Western weapon stocks. We see problems with artillery, ammunition. We're seeing similar problems now starting to develop with HIMARS rockets. And it's very, very easy to see how the same problem is going to start with Patriot systems as well. So, it all reminds me, and this is where we go back to this question of always being forced to escalate in response to what the other side has done, that the United States is in effect walking into a kind of trap where it's running to stand still as the Russians, who in this area, to quote Barack Obama, have escalatory dominance, are able, without too much difficulty, to crank up and respond to any American action with an even more powerful action of their own. It reminds me of what JFK said about Vietnam when he finally set his face against committing more US troops to the war in Vietnam, a decision, by the way, which was reversed by his successor, LBJ. Anyway, JFK said that sending troops, sending weapons, sending all of these things, committing to the defense of South Vietnam by sending all these men and material to South Vietnam, it was like drinking a glass of water. For a short time, it takes away the thirst, but eventually the thirst comes back, and what you find is that you need another, and another, and another, leading to the kind of overcommitment crisis that the United States eventually found itself trapped into, with disastrous consequences in Vietnam. We're on the same escalatory ladder in Ukraine. There are large numbers of people who are from intelligence and military backgrounds who are warning about this. I read a piece a short time ago, which had appeared in Newsweek, written by two US officials, ex-US officials, who appear to me to have intelligence backgrounds. They were warning against precisely this course. But unsurprisingly, in fact, entirely predictably, it is this very course of drinking a glass of water, seeing the effect wear off, needing another, that the current administration is leading the United States and the West into. I'm not sure where this point ends. Already we have American troops present in Ukraine. Supposedly they're in Western Ukraine. Supposedly they're unarmed. Supposedly they're only tracking weapons which have already been delivered to Ukraine. Well, as I said, you can believe that if you wish. But I wonder how far this administration is going to go, how big the commitment is going to be. The only thing I will say, and where I will finish this already lengthy video, is that just as was the case with the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, that they are pouring in reinforcements in order to justify the losses that they have already made. They can't back off. They're trapped in a process of escalation, even though that is turning out disastrous for them. It seems to me that the United States is at serious risk of ending up and doing the same thing to itself. Well, this has been a very long video. This is where I stop. I hope this has been useful. Of course, everybody who knows more about the Patriot systems than me is welcome to comment on the threads. I will keep an eye out on what people say. And thank you again for joining me. Reminder again, you can find all our programs on our other platforms, locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and Rockfin. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, our hoodies, our hats, and all those things. And last but not least, if you like this video, this very long video, please don't forget to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again, and more from me soon.